In the winding hills above Calabasas, California, nestled behind a high iron gate and a wall of overgrown cypress trees, sits a Mediterranean-style estate once owned by the late rock icon, Loaf. Known for his theatrical music and powerful voice, the singer spent the last 2 decades of his life in this house, which he reportedly called his sanctuary. Locals say he kept to himself, rarely seen outside except for brief walks down the driveway or when greeting a rare visitor. After his death in 2022, the property remained untouched for nearly a year. Real estate agents whispered of strange issues, showings canceled at the last minute, doors found open after being locked, lights flickering without power. The house lingered on the market until it was quietly purchased in early 2024 by a young couple from Austin, Texas, Daniel and Megan Ward. They had no idea what they were walking into. Daniel, a 34-year-old software developer, and Megan, a 31-year-old ceramic artist, had moved to California chasing a change in pace and scenery. They fell in love with the estate instantly. High arched ceilings, red tile roof, warm terracotta floors, and a secluded music studio beneath the house felt like a hidden retreat. Their offer was accepted quickly, almost too easily, they would later admit. The first few weeks were uneventful. Megan began converting the studio into a pottery workspace, while Daniel worked remotely from a sunlit office facing the canyon. They noted a few odd things. A grandfather clock in the hallway ticking despite not being wound, the soft creak of footsteps in the living room at night, faint humming from the studio floorboards. But they chalked it up to old house quirks. Until it got worse. Megan was the first to hear it clearly. Late one night while working on a vase in the basement studio, she heard a male voice singing deep, resonant, unmistakably theatrical. She froze. It was coming from the far corner, where old acoustic panels still lined the walls. There was no one else in the house. She ran upstairs, pale and trembling, trying to explain to Daniel what she'd heard. They began to notice patterns. Always after 2 a.m., always in that same part of the house. Some nights, there were thuds from upstairs while they were lying in bed. Doors would creak open just wide enough to make Megan feel watched. And twice, Daniel awoke gasping, having dreamt that someone was screaming lyrics directly into his face. He couldn't remember the words, only that they sounded like a performance. Then came the incident with the stereo. One Saturday evening, they had friends over. While playing a vinyl record through the old sound system left behind in the living room, the speakers suddenly cut out, followed by a deafening blast of music no one had cued. It was Bat Out of Hell, blasting from every speaker in the house. The volume climbed until one of the guests pulled the plug on the system. As the last notes faded, a strange echo like a whispered, "Do you love me now?" lingered in the silence. That night, the guests left early. Megan later found the old stereo system still unplugged, yet somehow blinking and softly humming. Over the next few months, Megan changed. She became fixated on the basement. She started sculpting busts of a man she claimed she'd never seen but kept showing up in her dreams. A large man with long hair, heavy features, and sorrowful eyes. The likeness was uncanny. Daniel, concerned for her mental health, booked a stay at a cabin near Big Bear to get her away from the house. On the second night there, Megan woke him up, mumbling in her sleep. Her eyes were open, but she didn't respond to him. She sat up and softly said, "He's not finished." When asked who, she simply said, "The one who sang to the dark." In desperation, Daniel contacted a local spiritual medium, a woman in her 60s named Lorraine Blakely, known around Los Angeles for her discretion and accuracy. She walked through the home slowly, barely touching anything. After nearly 2 hours in the basement, she emerged pale and shaken. "There's grief here," she said, "and music that won't stop playing." He didn't know how to rest. He still doesn't. Lorraine claimed the studio was a kind of anchor where emotion, art, and frustration were all embedded in the walls. He doesn't want to leave. This was his temple. When Daniel asked what they should do, Lorraine only said, "You either live with him, or you leave him." They made it another 6 weeks. Megan began sleepwalking regularly. She would hum melodies, some recognizable as Loaf's, others completely foreign. She stopped sculpting anything else. At night, Daniel would hear the faint sound of a piano even though there wasn't one in the house. On their final night, Megan stood outside at 3 a.m., barefoot, arms raised toward the dark hills, singing something slow and mournful. When Daniel approached her, she turned and said, "He's still waiting for the applause." They left the next morning and never returned. The estate sits vacant once again. Unlisted, unclaimed. Locals say it hums on quiet nights. That music floats through the canyon from nowhere. That sometimes, if you drive by slow with your windows down, you'll hear a single line echo from the hills. I would do anything for love, but no one lives there now, and no one dares to try again. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house stood silent in the morning haze, its clay roof tiles stained with time and fallen leaves, like a weathered crown atop a forgotten temple. The sun reached lazily over the hills, casting golden light through the cypress trees that lined the winding driveway. Dust shimmered in the air, visible through the narrow beams that pierced the shuttered windows. Though it was early, the house already felt heavy, as if weighed down by something no one could see. Daniel returned just after dawn to pick up some remaining items they'd left behind. They'd driven out 2 days prior with no intention of ever coming back. But Megan had insisted that he retrieve one thing: the last sculpture. He had tried to resist, but she was not herself until he agreed. Her voice took on a tone he hadn't heard before, calm but cold. "He needs to be remembered," she'd whispered. As Daniel unlocked the front door, he paused. The key turned with ease, though the door pushed open as if it had already been unlatched. He stepped inside, blinking against the sudden dimness. The interior smelled of cedar, old plaster, and something faintly metallic like rust or blood. The foyer was just as they'd left it. Moving boxes stacked neatly by the wall, a few unopened. But the house felt different now, less like a place recently abandoned and more like something preserved, watching him. He moved cautiously, almost reverently, toward the basement stairs. The ceramic bust Megan had sculpted stood at the foot of the staircase, as if guarding it. The resemblance to Loaf was even more unsettling in the low light. The strong brow, the downturned mouth, the soulful intensity locked forever in fired clay. Daniel had tried to destroy it once weeks ago, lifting it to throw it into the trash. But it had felt heavy, impossibly heavy, as if the house itself wouldn't let it go. The basement door groaned on its hinges as he opened it. The scent of dust and dry earth rose to meet him. He descended step by slow step, each creak of the wooden stairs amplified in the tight, dry air. When he reached the bottom, the chill hit him immediately, cold and still, like the inside of a stone crypt. The studio was just as Megan had left it. Shelves lined with jars of glaze and pigment, the pottery wheel at the center like some ancient altar. And in the far corner of the room, sitting just outside the reach of the overhead light, was the stereo. It was an old system, bulky, analog, and covered in fingerprints. No matter how many times he'd tried to clean it, the smudges always reappeared. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring. Then, almost involuntarily, he took a step closer. And another. The floor felt sticky beneath his shoes, though nothing was visible. The silence was pressing now, like cotton stuffed in his ears. Then came the click. The stereo, still unplugged, clicked on. No music played at first. Just a hum. A low, throaty vibration, like someone breathing into the room from inside the walls. Daniel froze. The basement lights flickered once, then steadied. Then, like the slow turning of an unseen dial, the first chords of a song began to play. It wasn't one of the hits. Not "I'd Do Anything for Love." Not 2 out of 3 Ain't Bad. It was something rougher, more primal. A recording from a live performance, maybe. The audio crackled with age. But beneath it, Daniel could hear the voice, that unmistakable voice belting with raw pain and theatrical fire. He stepped backward slowly, watching the stereo. And then the music stopped. Dead silence. Then a voice, not through the speakers, but from the darkness behind him, low and hoarse, as if forced through old lungs. "Why did you leave her?" Daniel spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Just the shelves, the sculptures, the bust now turned ever so slightly, no longer facing the stairs but turned toward him. Upstairs, the house groaned. The sound of slow, heavy footsteps echoed above him, crossing the living room floorboards in a steady rhythm. One step, pause, another step, then two at once. Daniel turned and raced up the stairs, stumbling, nearly falling. As he reached the top, the front door slammed shut in front of him violently, with a force that rattled the windows. He tried the handle. It didn't budge. Behind him, the stereo began to play again. This time it was louder, clearer. Meet Loaf's voice rising in a crescendo of theatrical desperation. Daniel could hear every word, every breath. The lyrics seemed twisted now, wrong, like they were meant just for him. You took what I gave you and ran into the light. He pressed his back to the door. The chandelier above him began to sway slightly. One of the windows cracked from the inside. Then the smell hit him, smoke. Faint but unmistakable, like burnt leather and sweat, like the backstage of an arena after the encore. He turned his head slowly toward the hallway. There, through the dim light, he saw a shape. Broad-shouldered, unmoving, a man. Standing in the hallway between the kitchen and the music room, almost lost in shadow. His face was unclear, but the hair was long, the posture strangely regal. His hands were down at his sides. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came. The figure tilted its head slowly like a performer waiting for a cue. Then, in a voice that was almost a growl, "Finish the song." Daniel didn't remember unlocking the door or running to the car. What he remembered was the cold and unnatural cold that clung to his skin even in the California heat. By the time he backed out of the driveway, tires screaming against the worn gravel, his hands were trembling so violently he could barely steer. The house disappeared behind the curve of the hill, but it felt like it followed him, as if something inside had leaned out through the windows to watch him flee. He drove aimlessly through the canyon for nearly an hour, engine humming, windows down, trying to convince himself it had been stress, exhaustion, suggestion. But he knew better. He'd seen the man, the shape. The voice hadn't come from his imagination. It had come from somewhere, a place layered over theirs like a film just slightly out of sync with reality. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove straight to the motel where Megan had been staying since their rushed departure. It was a modest roadside inn off the 101, the kind of place with flickering signs and vending machines that never worked. He knocked on her door just past noon. Megan answered with red eyes and dry clay under her fingernails. Her hair was unwashed. Her lips were cracked. Without a word, she stepped aside and let him in. The motel room smelled of soap, burnt coffee, and something faintly sour. Her sculptures were everywhere, on the nightstand, the counter, the window ledge. All of them were versions of the same face, slightly altered. Some smiling, some screaming, some weeping silently. The likeness of Meat Loaf was unmistakable. Daniel closed the door behind him and stood in the center of the room, his heart still racing. "Megan," he said finally. "I went back." She didn't look up. "I brought your sculpture like you asked. But something happened." Megan's eyes lifted slowly, and for the first time in weeks, he saw something familiar behind them. Not the cold, possessed glaze she'd worn for days, but fear. Honest fear. "You saw him," she whispered. Daniel nodded once. "He won't let it end," she said. "He's still down there, waiting for something." "For what?" "I don't know," Megan whispered. "Maybe for an audience. Maybe for applause. Maybe for one more song." That night they spoke little. Megan sat on the bed, legs crossed beneath her, tracing invisible patterns on her palm. Daniel stood near the window, staring at the parking lot where the neon vacancy sign buzzed and popped with tired electricity. The sky above was moonless. Still, around midnight, Megan finally stood. She opened the mini fridge and pulled out a small clay box she'd sculpted and fired days ago. Inside it was a reel of tape, old, brittle, magnetic tape spooled carefully onto a reel-to-reel core. Daniel furrowed his brow. "What is that?" "I found it in the walls," she said. Behind the acoustic panels in the studio, it was wrapped in a black handkerchief. I didn't tell you because I thought maybe it was his. Something he didn't want found. She placed it gently on the dresser and stared at it for a long moment. It feels alive, she whispered. Like it hums when I touch it. I can feel it in my teeth. They sat together on the bed, the reel between them. Neither dared to move. The motel room grew colder, the overhead light flickering even though it had burned steadily all night. Megan turned her head slightly. We have to go back. Daniel's breath caught. To the house. She nodded. Something's incomplete. That's why he's still there. What do you mean? He was working on something when he died. Something no one ever heard. Maybe he recorded it down there. Maybe this tape. Or maybe we should burn it. Daniel snapped, his voice rising for the first time. Maybe we should burn the whole goddamn house down and bury everything that's in it. Megan stared at him, and her voice dropped to something fragile, something exhausted. I don't think we can. They returned to the house just before dusk. The gate had been chained shut since Daniel left. The sun hung low in the sky, bleeding orange over the canyons. They parked on the side of the road and climbed over the gate. Silence stretched between them. No birdsong, no wind. Even the trees felt stiller than they should have been. The front door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was colder than they remembered. Not sharp or bitter, but dense, thick enough that breathing felt like inhaling through a wet towel. The hallway was darker, the high ceilings heavier. And the stereo downstairs, though unplugged, was glowing faintly again. Megan moved ahead of Daniel this time, her hand clutching the reel like a relic. They reached the bottom of the basement stairs, and the silence broke, faint at first, then rising, humming. Low, melodic humming. Not a song they knew, not one they could know, but familiar in tone, in intent. The lights buzzed. The walls seemed to tremble. Then, from the studio speakers, without ever being touched, came the scratch of a tape being threaded. It was impossible but unmistakable. The speakers let out a long hiss, and then the voice returned, not angry, not mournful, but ready. Let's take it from the top. The tape began to play. There was no fanfare, no instruments, no introduction, just the sound of deep, labored breathing, like a man waiting in the wings of a theater, gathering strength before stepping into the light. It went on for nearly a minute. Daniel and Megan stood frozen, side by side, their shadows stretching long behind them under the flickering studio light. Then the voice came in. Not the bombastic howl from Meat Loaf's legendary albums. Not the soaring, operatic baritone the world had come to know. This was something quieter, raw, almost fragile. I don't know how to end this. I don't know if I should. The voice trembled slightly, then steadied. They say if you sing it out loud, it becomes real. That if your soul's got weight, it echoes. And then music, soft at first, like the strum of a single guitar from a distant room. The tape was old, frayed at the edges, and pieces of it warped as it played. But the melody was there, haunting, wistful, full of something unspoken. Megan fell to her knees. Her hands shook around the reel, and her eyes filled with tears, not fear, but recognition. She whispered under her breath, "It's the song he never finished. This is it." Daniel felt the air around them shift. The walls didn't just hold sound anymore, they held presence. The kind of stillness a church might have when no one speaks. A kind of reverence. Then came the chorus. And with it something changed. It wasn't just music now. It was performance. Lights snapped on around them, fixtures that hadn't worked in years. One by one, they flickered to life, casting warm amber glow around the studio. The cracked mirrors reflected a space that didn't quite match the physical room, as if time had peeled back a layer. The floor shimmered faintly, as though under stage lights. From the far corner of the room, something moved. A figure emerged, slowly, like a curtain being drawn aside. Not quite solid, not quite smoke. The shape was unmistakable, broad-shouldered, long-haired, wearing a floor-length coat that shimmered between red velvet and black leather. He stepped into view not with menace, but with purpose. His face flickered clear one moment, blurred the next. But the eyes, they were vivid, human, exhausted, hopeful. He looked at Megan first, then at Daniel. Then, he looked beyond them toward something they could not see. His lips moved, and though no sound came from him directly, the voice poured from the speakers. Loud, emotional, beautiful. One last time, I'll sing what haunts the dark. Not for fame, not for love, but because I can't leave this part. The music swelled. Not just from the speakers now, it filled the walls, the floors, even the air. Megan was weeping openly. Daniel stood stunned. His body flooded with the kind of awe that turns your legs numb and your hands cold. The figure stepped forward, arms opening, as if addressing an audience only he could see. He took a bow, long and low. A spotlight blinked on from nowhere and illuminated him. Dust danced in the beam, and then, a wave of it, not thunderous, not stadium loud, but warm, intimate, sincere, as if the house itself had remembered what it was made for, as if the ghosts of thousands of unseen hands clapped in unison for a performance they had waited years to hear. The man smiled, for the first time completely, and as the tape finished its final note, trembling like the last breath of a candle before it gutters, the figure began to fade. Slowly, peacefully, with no pain, no rage, no regret, only release. He looked at Megan once more. He nodded as if saying thank you. Then he was gone, and the studio was silent. Megan and Daniel stood in that silence for a long time, not speaking, not moving. The lights dimmed on their own, gently, as though bowing with the performer. The reel spun slowly until it stopped. No coldness remained in the air, no weight pressing down on their chests, only quiet and calm. They didn't sleep that night. They sat in the living room with candles and tea and let the quiet settle. Sometime after 4 a.m., Megan said softly, "He just needed to be heard." Daniel nodded, not needing to say anything. They never tried to play the tape again. Not because they feared it, but because they knew it had served its purpose. The performance had ended. The curtain had fallen. They stayed in the house. And it changed. No more voices. No more cold spots or flickering lights. Megan returned to her pottery. But now she sculpted other things, landscapes, vessels, forms of her own. The busts disappeared. Daniel moved his office into the old studio, keeping the stereo as it was, though he never played music on it. One evening, while cleaning the basement, Daniel found something in the corner beneath a dusty tarp. An old framed poster from the late 1970s, "Bat Out of Hell," signed in thick black marker, "To the next dreamer. Leave it better than you found it, Emil." He hung it by the studio door. Sometimes at night, when the canyon is quiet and the wind moves just right, Megan says she can still hear the faintest hum coming from the studio. Not a ghost, not a warning, but a voice singing gently into the dark. A final encore for a song that was once unfinished, and now finally complete. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.